What did the Battle of Cannae actually look like? Modelling the Battle of Cannae in true size is a gargantuan undertaking. A battle featuring one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled, whose frontage was so vast that it would take over 40 minutes to walk across, and so deep that you could fit an entire soccer field between the front and the rear ranks. Even Napoleonic artillery stationed at one end of the field would lack the range to reach more than half of the army before it. Such are the scales we are dealing with. Without the benefit of a time machine, this has long been left a mystery. However, in this series we leverage the expertise of historians such as Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy and the power of tools like Unreal Engine 5 to bring the past to life with the most detailed simulation of this climactic battle ever attempted. From the often overlooked scale of the city-sized camps which hosted the vast armies assembled that day, to the hours-long logistical nightmare of deploying 130,000 men from these camps into formations on the field of battle, and the stunning blow-by-blow phases by which Hannibal managed the incredible feat of enveloping and destroying an army twice his size. We bring you back in time to experience it all from both a bird's-eye perspective in the skies above and the boots on the ground in the thick of the action. The skirmishers, the cavalry, the infantry, and the generals. The end result is a revolutionary new way to not only visualize the massive battles of antiquity, but to derive novel academic conclusions which challenge how we understand them. So today, let's dive into this fascinating simulation. This is the true size of the Battle of Cannae.
It's been an absolute honor to work with Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy on this project, as he is the reason I started making history documentaries in the first place, and it warms my heart to learn that I've actually inspired others to take on their own historical projects. This video in particular was actually brought to you by a member of the community who's writing a series on the 10th Legion.
Yeah, so my book is The 10th Legion, Some Things Should Never Be Done. It is a historical fictional biography, so it follows the life of a real centurion, Gaius Crastinus. He was the first centurion for Julius Caesar's 10th Legion. The 10th Legion was known throughout history as Caesar's personal legion, and without them, he really doesn't become emperor, and the Roman Empire doesn't exist. So he's a fascinating character in history. We know a lot about him, like the battles he participated in and what he did for Caesar, but we know nothing about his actual life other than that. So I really wanted to show people, people who love the Roman history, delve into this world. What real life was like for a Roman legionnaire, being recruited, being trained, actually going on campaigns, and then going through and detailing his life, following the real actual events, and as true to history as I can. So although it is fictional work, I'm trying to follow that exact history as best I can. So
I know I'm a little jealous of your efforts here, because that's the thing with our series is I want to bring stuff to life and live in color. Like history in color used to be our tagline. And you can only get so far with the documentaries. And I've always wanted to do something like this, which is like in the head of a person in the past, recreate all the little nitty gritty details. So I'm happy that you've gone and done this. This is an awesome endeavor. And I think people will really appreciate it. Educational, entertaining and all that. So if people want to get a taste of it, kind of where can they do that for either a preview or a download?
Yeah, so the book is available on Amazon right now. I am a self-published author through Kindle Direct. So on Amazon.com, you can type in the search, The 10th Legion, Some Things Should Never Be Done. or my name, CR Reese, and it should pop up there. It is available right now in the United States and UK. But if you're in another country and you'd love it, please put it on your wish list and have Amazon carry it for you there. But I'd love if you could check it out. I really love what Invicta has done, the community they have built, the videos and the content is amazing. And so I really appreciate it, and it was such a huge help to me, and I'm hoping to contribute a little bit of my own.
Modelling the Battle of Cannae in true size is a gargantuan undertaking. While we shall be presenting our reconstruction, other interpretations exist. In acknowledgement of this fact, it will be best to begin by describing the key assumptions of our model. First, we can begin in the abstract with the army sizes. Here, Polybius tells us that the Romans deployed 16 legions, 8 Roman and 8 allied, which in total numbered 80,000 infantry and roughly 6,000 cavalry. Assuming an average distribution of soldiers, we find that each legion has 5,000 men, with the following breakdown of troop types. At the smallest level, this means each century, with the exception of the triarii, has on average 73 men. A roughly 20% increase over the 60 men who were part of the usual muster. Such inflated figures are in keeping with the idea that the army had been deliberately supersized by Rome in an attempt to outmuscle Hannibal. The cavalry, on the other hand, were proportionately much smaller, consisting of but 7.5% of the total troop count. This was due to recent losses and the difficulty of finding sufficient mounts on such short notice. Breaking out these riders, we have assumed each Roman legion musters 10 termi of 30 troopers for a total of 2,400 cavalry. This leaves us with a remainder of 3,600 for the Allies, which roughly tracks with Livy's sources, claiming the Allies had provided twice as many horsemen. The entire force is under the command of consuls Paulus and Varro, with command alternating each day. On the Carthaginian side, Polybius tells us that Hannibal deployed 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, making their size 58% that of the Romans. Beyond this, we have but informed speculation to go on. Based on accounts of prior battles in the campaign, we shall assume the following distribution of infantry units. Though greatly outnumbered by their Roman equivalents, these are well-seasoned veteran troops who have also been able to upgrade their gear through the spoils of victory. As for the cavalry, we will assume 4,000 are Gallic, 2,000 are Iberian, and 4,000 are Numidian. In this singular category, does Hannibal actually outnumber his foe with 66% more riders? This will prove to have grave consequences. Taken all together, we see that there are in total 136,000 troops accounted for. An insanely large army, which was even more numerous when we consider the likely presence of thousands more support forces and camp followers. Now let us transport the armies to the battlefield of Cannae. But to do so requires knowing exactly where that is. It's a rather thorny issue for any attempted recreations of the battle. To offer insight on this matter, we can now turn to Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy.
The sources for Cannae are pretty good for a battle in the ancient world, and we can narrow down the location fairly well. We know where the ancient town of Cannae was. Beyond that, everything gets a little bit more difficult. Our best sources tell us about the orientation of the armies in relation to the river Aufidius. The problem is that this river is on a wide, fairly flat plain and moves regularly. I visited the site when I was doing research for my books in the late 90s. I took with me all the maps I could find from various scholarly analyses, some of them dating back to the 19th century, some of them 20th century. I also had a modern Italian road map of the area, as big a scale as I could find. And when I came there, the first thing that struck me was that the river was in a different position on each of these maps, but also the river I could see in front of me on that summer's afternoon was again on a different line to all the maps that I had. It just emphasized how much the river moves across this floodplain, which then means that trying to understand if, as I argue, the battle did occur between the river and the hill on which the town of Cannae stood, just how much space there was, how wide was this plain, and was it possible that you could actually fit these very large armies into that space? So there are lots of problems with Cannae that nature doesn't help with. There hasn't been any archaeology that we could really establish the battlefield, even if that's possible. You have to be lucky to find the right things. There's talk of earlier finds, but they may be confused with medieval battles fought near there as well. We can't narrow down where the river was in 216 BC. So there's a lot of guesswork involved, which is why looking in this way and mapping in this way and doing everything to scale is absolutely invaluable. So I argue for the battle being fought between the river and the hill on which the town of Cannae stands. This would mean that this is in a very confined space. At the most, we're talking about a width of about 3 kilometers from the hill to the river. So is it the maximum 3 kilometers for a battle line? That's assuming they go straight at sort of 90 degrees between the two. If there's more of an angle, then things are different. So this would mean that this was a very dense, crowded, narrow battlefield. For me, that makes sense. The day before, the Romans had declined an offer of battle from Hannibal to the north of the river. Now, the land there is very open. There are no features on which to rest your flanks. There's a lot more space. Hannibal's got better cavalry than the Romans. He's got more of it than the Romans. In previous battles, those cavalry have swept around the flanks and enveloped the Roman line. So the Romans know they don't want that to happen. The Romans have got tons of infantry. Their infantry has done well, has broken through the center at Trebia, at Trasimene. So for me, it makes sense. Fight somewhere narrow and restricted where, although you won't be able to deploy your numbers initially to the full, nevertheless, they can't be outflanked. The great strength of your army is protected, and you deliver a sledgehammer blow straight at the middle of Hannibal's line. So for me, that makes sense. And the fact that it is narrow is actually an argument in favor rather than an argument against it. On the other hand, some scholars have argued that, well, this is far too narrow, and of course, depending on where the river actually was, you might not have 3 kilometers, you might not have 2 kilometers, you might have even left, in which case the arguments for this become less and less likely. They've tended to position it to the south of the town, or to the east of the hill with the town, so that you still have the river on the same flanks of the army, but there is much more open country. There's nothing really to anchor the Roman left, the Carthaginian right, in the same way that you're between a river and a hill, if you're in the other position. This has the advantage of space. There's plenty of room for everybody. Disadvantages are this, however. One is that why fight here? How is this different from the land north of the river, where there's plenty of open space? So why would the Romans be willing to fight here when they hadn't been willing to fight somewhere else? And why bother to cross the river? You could have just challenged for battle on the north bank, if that's what you wanted to do, where Hannibal had offered it before. The other thing is, when I visited the site, I walked back, having got a lift down to Cannae. I walked back because I wanted to look at this ground, and there is a very clear, very definite slope down from the hill around Cannae towards the coast. So if you had deployed in this area, one thing is that the Carthaginian deployment and where the units were would have been more obvious to see, because they would be deployed up a slope, and any troops behind in reserve, hidden like the Libyans, would have been easier to see, perhaps. I mean, again, you can argue about that. The other thing is the Romans would have been attacking uphill, and even a slight advantage like this on a fairly gentle slope is something that ancient armies take great trouble to avoid. So for that reason, I just don't buy this. But it's not a case that you can prove either way. And again, coming to test things is okay with this number of people in this sort of formation. How much space do they take? That's the great advantage of experiments like this.
As you can see, even the foremost historians on the matter are unable to draw definitive conclusions. Given the results of our upcoming simulations on the army formations, we find it more probable that the battle took place along the eastern plains. But regardless of the exact placement of the armies, many of the observations from this simulation of Cannae will apply to either hypothesis. With that being said, let us now proceed. Given the aforementioned uncertainties of the exact battle lines, we are lucky to at least be able to work off the known location of the town of Cannae, whose ruins can still be seen today. This is where we will begin our tour. It is late July in 216 BC. The hot summer sun beats down upon the dry lands of Apulia as the seasonal Volturnus blows in from the south. Where Roman farmers once ruled these lands, now Hannibal is their master. Over the past few weeks, the great Punic general has laid claim to the site, whilst campaigning in the Apulia region of southern Italy as part of his daring invasion of Roman territory during the Second Punic War. The town of Cannae itself holds strategic value as a large supply depot with a defensible position atop a ridgeline hill. As you can see, it has a commanding view of the surrounding plains, which are filled with open farmland. Also of note is the Orpheus River to the north, which lazily winds its way across the gently sloping landscape towards the coast of the Adriatic Sea, some 8 kilometers to the northeast. Though Hannibal controls the town, his army is too large to fit inside. Thus, he initially sets up camp outside, likely atop the nearby high ground. From here, he can still survey the area, whilst also maintaining ready access to the river, from which he can draw fresh water for thirsty men and horses. Within a few days, he observes dust clouds to the north from the vast Roman army, which has been shadowing his every move. Setting off in this direction, we see that several kilometers away, the consuls have established their own camp on the opposite side of the river. Here, they too can draw from its waters to refresh the troops. Circling the camp, we can marvel at its immense size. Housing over 100,000 men, each side of its perimeter easily measures over a kilometer across. This is a city on the move. The sheer scale means that it cannot stay in one place for long without suffering supply issues. Thus, to mitigate these problems and to secure access to the river, a second, smaller camp is built on the other side of the Orpheus. But such measures can only delay the inevitable. Soon the consuls will have to relocate, either to engage the Carthaginians or to continue avoiding them. Hannibal is well aware of this fact and wants a fight on this ground. To press the issue, he now moves his camp to the same side of the river as the main Roman position. Doing so would have taken the greater part of a day. Flying to this new camp, we see that it is somewhat smaller than that of the legions, but no less impressive in size. It too remains tethered to the river and must deal with issues of supply. Thus, as both sides now face off, they are up against a logistical ticking clock. But who will make the first move? Historically, scenarios such as this evolve into a psychological game between generals. Naturally, both sides wish to fight with the most advantages stacked up on their side before committing to an engagement. A large factor to consider is that each army has already dug in and will be at an advantage if the foe is forced to charge into their defenses. But on the flip side, to remain passive in this manner betrays a lack of confidence, both to the enemy and to one's own soldiers. This can be even more important, as morale, after all, is what can win or lose a fight. Thus, commanders will often deploy troops in the open ground as a performative offering of battle. How far forward such battle lines are drawn is an additional barometer of an army's confidence. In this case, it is Hannibal who first offers battle on August 1st. Paulus, supposedly the more cautious of the two Roman consuls, holds command and refuses out of an apparent fear that the open ground here will be to the great advantage of the enemy's more numerous cavalry. Hannibal capitalizes on this morale boost with another ploy to gain an advantage. He now sends the Numidians across the river to chase off Roman foragers. Despite the nearby presence of both camps, they are impotent to prevent the harassment. It is another humiliating blow to the legions. Thus, as the more impetuous consul Varro prepares to take command the following day, he has been sufficiently goaded to make an aggressive countermove. At dawn, on the 2nd of August, 216 BC, a red vexillum is raised outside the tent of Commander Varro. This is a traditional signal that battle is to be given. However, we must imagine that the troops had more advance notice than to wake up to such a sign. Orders would have been distributed the night before to the military tribunes and the praefecti of the Ali, whose job it was to disseminate the command down the ranks and to supervise its execution. Thus, as the sun rises, it lights upon the massing ranks of infantry formations already assembling into their unit columns along the open ground of the intervallum. From here, they will be guided out, one behind the other, in a procession leading out to the battlefield. As the great coiled snake of the Roman army slowly unfurls, its immense size is evident by the laborious nature of the process. Arranged in column, it takes each legion roughly half an hour to simply leave the camp. Thus, with two camps spilling forth simultaneously from their main gates, we can approximate that it will take the 16 legions around 2 to 4 hours to fully emerge, when accounting for bottlenecks and other delays. From here, their multi-kilometer long bodies will slither into position, trampling through fields and splashing through waters. At the same time, Hannibal keeps a close watch on the Roman force. With spies and perhaps even intercepted deserters, he is informed of Consul Varro's decision to offer battle. Thus, as the direction of the enemy's advance is revealed, the Punic commander now directs his men to match course. The offer for battle has been accepted. Hannibal's army now emerges from its own coils and slithers across the land. As if to message his agreement to the Romans, a massive plume of dust now rises from the Punic camp. From the perspective of an observer miles away, it would appear as if the two sides were deliberately coordinating their intentions with smoke signals. But as the vast dust clouds rise higher in the skies and slowly advance towards one another, it is clear that a showdown of monumental proportions is about to take place. This is all noted by observers from Rome who ride back to the city to report on such tidings. By the time they arrive, the fate of Cannae will already have been determined. But now, let us race against the writing of history to watch as it unfolds. Along our battlefield, the units of either side are moving into position. By tradition, this takes place by first sending out a screen of light troops to cover the deployment of the main body. At Cannae, such a maneuver involves the mobilization of some 25 to 30,000 skirmishers. a prodigious amount of troops whose numbers alone would rival the largest battles of the medieval era. Here, they are but a holding force. Behind the skirmisher screen, the battle lines are drawn. This process involves the army columns marching to the extreme ends of the formation and falling into line. It is a simple process of follow the leader, which can be executed by even the most green troops. However, regardless of simplicity, deployments of this scale take time, and it can be many more hours before the last of the troops trickle in. From the ground level, it is entirely unclear to any of the participants what is going on beyond their immediate vicinity. They must simply trust in the process, while officers ride back and forth to coordinate the movements of a blind Goliath. Luckily for us, we can observe the entire battlefield from above. This is a view never experienced before, and thus never documented. As a result, our presentation is speculative reconstruction based on vague, myopically constrained sources. For some insight into the nuances of this reconstructive process, we can turn once more to military historian Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy.
Now, as is always the case with the ancient world, we don't have too much information about what was normal, what was typical, whether there was a standard formation for the maniple or whether it rather depended on circumstances in the ground where you were fighting. But the suggestion that they're many times deeper than they're wide rather suggests that that wasn't true and that they were shallower under normal circumstances. Beyond that, though, we don't have any details, so just how narrow, how deep, and how narrow were the gaps between individual maniples. There's a whole debate about the checkerboard formation and whether the gaps between maniples closed up when the fighting actually began or not. But in this case, clearly the gaps are made significantly smaller, therefore there's less need for that, there's less requirement for that. Just how you do it would depend, and remember, all of this is going to be guesswork. So we assume that because he talks about the units, which we normally translate as maniples as being there, you kept with the normal triplex acies the three lines of Hastati, Principes and Triarii, and that each individual maniple was narrower fronted, deeper and closer together with its neighbours on either side, and presumably the Latins that are on either flank in the ally are doing much the same thing. But again, precisely what that means, most ancient authors assume we know this sort of stuff. There's no need to tell or explain, therefore they don't bother. And the technical manuals, if they existed, have not survived. So that a lot of things we assume about ancient warfare, you will often hear said, and I've written it, that the standard depth, the typical depth for a Greek phalanx was 8 deep. There's very little evidence for that, really very, very little, and none at all for the Roman army of this period as to just what's going on.
When it comes to reconstructing Cannae specifically, we have founded our model upon the better understood dynamics of the Roman army. At a high level, we are confident from our sources that it consists of the Allied cavalry to the east, the infantry in the center, and the Roman cavalry in the west. Zooming in begins to reveal some of the uncertainties. The infantry, for instance, here consists of just 14 legions, with the assumption that 2 entire legions have been left behind in camp, in keeping with Polybius's claim that 10,000 troops were held back to guard the baggage and threaten the enemy's camp. Zooming in closer, we see that the individual legions still maintain their multi-layered formation of infantry tiers, but have arranged themselves in a deep, tight formation rather than the more typical checkerboard pattern. This is an interpretation of Polybius's report that the maniples were, quote, closer together than usual and many times deeper than they were wide. Here we have assumed a total legionary depth of 50 men, though some scholars push this to an excess of 70 men. In either case, using standard troop spacing and accounting for gaps between units, we end up with a total depth of around 100 meters for the heavy infantry. This is an extremely unorthodox formation in light of the fact that most armies of the period drew up in files of 4 to 8 men or 10 to 20 meters deep. The reason being that while depth improves staying power, each added rank yields diminishing returns. Any extra manpower is better used to extend that unit's width with which to outflank one's foe. But at Cannae, the Romans have more than enough manpower to spare. Already, the infantry span almost 2 kilometers in width. By going deeper, the consuls apparently wish to ensure that their green troops are as insulated as possible from morale shocks. Dropping down to the ground perspective of a soldier in the midst of this formation, it is easy to see its psychological advantages. To all sides, one is surrounded by comrades, while the front lines are nearly a soccer field away. All this means that the vast majority of Roman troops can expect to do nothing more than stand in line and let the sheer weight of their ranks brute force its way to victory. If they are lucky, they might catch a glimpse of the action along the front. Zooming back out, we can now turn our attention to the cavalry. The nature of their formations are even less well understood, as will be emphasized by Dr. Goldsworthy.
When you come to cavalry, you have to think in a very different way to infantry, and that's quite hard for us to do because most of us don't necessarily know much about horses. We're certainly not used to horses in these sorts of numbers. You don't see thousands of cavalrymen anywhere in the world today. So even the big parades and the ceremonial units you have, they're not on that sort of scale. And when movies have extras mounted, they never have those sorts of numbers. And of course, these days they'll be adding lots of extra CGI horsemen. So the big blocks of Rohirrim you see in the Pelennor Fields in the Return of the King movie, they look very visually impressive, but that is not the way any real cavalry would operate. Because the whole point of cavalry is speed, maneuverability, movement. They are not like infantrymen who will go forward and perhaps best go forward slowly and then slog it out with the enemy. They'll charge, the enemy will run, or they will be chased back. You chase them till you start to get scattered, you start to get blown, they have reserves, then they chase you back, your reserves chase them back, and so on. Ancient authors characterize cavalry warfare as incredibly fluid, back and forth, quite hard to understand, and exactly the same pattern was still visible in the 18th, 19th century. You could read about Waterloo, and it's exactly the same there. That's the way lots of horses behave. So it's best not to think of big blocks similar to the infantry when we come to cavalry. And probably we're thinking more of troops, squadrons, individual units forming several lines but with large gaps between them to allow this maneuverability, to allow this flexibility, because you pack lots of horses closely together and you're just going to end up with a big stampede either forward or backwards, but something you can't control. Witness the defeat of the Pompeian cavalry at Pharsalus, where several thousand of them are stampeded by a relatively small number of infantry. They can't recover from that. And the less trained the horses are, the more important it is to keep them in separate blocks and separate units, because they just get excited and they're inclined to run in the same direction as everybody else. So you have to think of groups of 30 men like the Roman turma, 40, 50, 100, maybe 200. Units like that, but lots of them and in more than one line. Now that's a very different way of thinking about how these will be deployed to our standard nice little rectangle on a map where this represents 500, 1,000, 5,000 men. With cavalry in particular, you shouldn't think that way for infantry, but with cavalry it's fatal to think that way. They need lots more space. Polybius talks about cavalrymen requiring double the amount of frontage that infantry of the same numbers would require. But it's not quite as simple as, you just spread them out and each cavalryman requires twice the space. It's the units require space around them. So that's what mattered. We've got to think of lots of little blocks, a little bit like some of those 17th century woodcuts and engravings of English Civil War battles and that sort of thing.
With these ideas in mind, our model assumes that the Roman cavalry are compactly deployed in their 30-men termi. with separation between rows of units to allow for the more fluid engagement of mounted troops. As such, their frontage is about 600 meters across and 70 meters deep. Flipping to the other side, we can now examine the disposition of the Carthaginians. Here there is very little precedent to draw upon for their reconstruction. Thus, our model largely relies on matching the width of their Roman counterparts and adding depth to reach the troop counts given to us by our sources. Namely, this includes the roughly 4,000 Numidian cavalry under Hanno on the eastern flank, Gallic and Iberian cavalry under Hasdrubal on the western flank, and the 35,000 infantry under Hannibal and Mago in the center. Of this last group, we have assumed that approximately 5,000 troops have been left back at camp to counter Rome's own 10,000 troops, which were siphoned off to threaten their baggage train. Diving deeper, we can now explore the infantry. It is here that Hannibal uses the non-Punic troops to form his famous crescent at the start of battle. Typical media depictions tend to over-exaggerate its shape without accounting for the practicalities of such a formation. In reality, it is likely that the battle line consisted of an eclectic mix of small warbands of around 200 to 500 men, which were arranged in echelon, one next to the other. In theory, each unit might advance further out than its neighbour to increase the overall bowing of the line. However, they would have been hesitant to advance too far and expose their flanks. Thus, by assuming that each unit overlaps significantly with its neighbour, our model results in a crescent with a maximum depth of a mere 85 meters at the center. Given that the frontage of the infantry is almost 2 kilometers across, this is an exceptionally shallow crescent. Such a finding begins to cast doubt on traditional understandings regarding the purpose and function of the crescent at Cannae. This shall be discussed further when we simulate the actual combat along this front. For more thoughts on the matter, we can turn once more to Dr. Goldsworthy.
Anything that's unique is always harder to study because there aren't parallels. And there's nothing quite like this. There have been various theories that the naval battle of Ecnomus had similar tactics to Cannae and all this sort of thing, but none of them really hold any water or any weight. They just don't make sense. It's better to see this not as a plan that Hannibal had in the back of his mind for years, and I've got this cunning idea, but something tailored to his army in relation to the Roman army and where he was fighting and the circumstances of that battle. And the build-up to it, the campaign, something that's right for today and will work for today, because he's not doing the same thing elsewhere, and he doesn't try and do this again anywhere else. So that means it's difficult. The probability is that this is rather less dramatic and shallower than many diagrams will show, but then diagrams need to emphasize. So just what was necessary? The point clearly is that Hannibal wishes the very center of his line to get into contact before other parts of it. So the very central unit is advanced some distance, we don't know how far, is it 10 meters, 100 meters, more, whatever it might be. Again, this is something that the model can test very, very well and give us an idea of what this would look like. But a lot depends on how people would behave. So he wants the Romans to make contact there first. Is that in the expectation the rest of the Roman line will stop while that's being fought and until they're pushed back? Is it that this will start to make the Roman line more ragged as they begin to come forward, that some might attack, start their charge, start their volley of missiles at a greater distance? We'll come on to all of this later, but it's difficult to know precisely what Hannibal intends, so it's all a question of experimenting. It's bound to be shallower than the Roman formation because you're covering the same frontage as a far more numerically superior force of Romans. There's a lot of Romans out there, you're trying to match their frontage. But that also means that it's much less dense as to what's going on. There's more space for not just individual units to act and react and support each other, move backwards and forwards depending on how the fighting is going, but also for officers, commanders to move around.
Having covered the formation of the non-African infantry, we can now turn our attention to the Libyans. Our sources are unclear on their deployment, with Livy stating vaguely, quote, "They were used to form the two wings which had been drawn back." Some depictions show them stacked in deep columns. But once more, we should question the practicality of such exaggerated deployments. Working in true size, we see that there is little benefit to having the units so far back from the front. At the scales we are working with, any position they might adopt locally results in the equivalent distance required to move from the wings towards the center or around the flanks for an envelopment. Thus, we have chosen to deploy the Libyans at no greater depth than the legions, whose formation was already considered overkill in terms of staying power. Ultimately, this seems to have been their role in battle: to hold as an unbreakable bastion of elite troops that could be mobilized when the time came to strike at vulnerable Roman forces. With this in mind, we can now turn to the cavalry on the wings. To the east, we find the Numidian light cavalry. Here, we have modelled them as loosely spaced units which can easily maneuver for evasive skirmishing against the enemy. The end result is a formation of equivalent numbers to the Roman allies opposite them, but with a greater overall footprint. Meanwhile, on the western flank, we find the Gallic and Iberian cavalry. They number about 2.5 times that of the Romans standing against them. The severity of this mismatch is reflected in our model by the idea that while they might intend to fight as close order cavalry, their great numbers have forced them to separate into multiple groups to preserve command and control and avoid devolving into a stampeding herd. Any one of these groups has sufficient strength to greatly damage the Roman cavalry on its own. Massed in this way, though, the combined might of the Carthaginians is poised to absolutely flatten them. Now that we have painstakingly laid out our model of the armies at Cannae, we can take a step back to appreciate the results of their true size. Based on our assumptions, it measures over 3 kilometers across. Let us now fly across the battlefield to get a more visceral sense of the scales involved. For a more grounded approach, we might even consider simulating a walk across the battlefield. But to do so would take roughly 40 minutes. Even when simulating a horse making the journey, it would take a rider around 5 minutes at full gallop to race from one end to the other. As a final measure of the battlefield's size, we can now fire off a Napoleonic cannon across its breadth. As the shot arches across the battlefield, it passes by endless ranks of soldiers. Even under the best conditions, the cannon's maximum range will only get us halfway across the field. The scales here are simply unfathomable. Given all this, we must marvel at what it would have been like to experience such an event where the scale of the conflict stretches from horizon to horizon. For soldiers, at least they can be resigned to focusing on the more comprehensible scope of their immediate surroundings. Leaders, on the other hand, are afforded no such luxury. The burden of command demands that generals and their officers must somehow remain apprised of matters across the entire front.
It's going to be very hard for anybody to see all of it. It's a big army, you're on a fairly flat plain, You don't have a vantage point. Your two senior commanders, your consuls, each choose to command one of the cavalry wings to keep those in the fight as long as possible so that the center can win. Once they're there, they can't see very much beyond the area immediately around them. They can see the enemy, but they can't see much more than that. One of the big drawbacks of reducing the gaps between the maniples, making the maniples deeper, but packing everybody into that space, is that there is less room for staff officers, senior officers, and their support staff to ride around the formation, to ride amongst the Roman line. It's much harder to get around. It's also harder to see anything. So the command and control element is a problem right from the very start. But again, it comes back to this: we've got a simple plan, all we've got to do is go forward and eat our way into the enemy line. In contrast to the Romans, Hannibal has a rather more conventional battle line. Yes, it's got the crescent and everything, but in terms of the depth of formations, how densely packed they are, there's no indication he's trying to match the Romans by cramming everybody in. His formations are relatively shallow in comparison to the Romans. There'll be intervals between the units. Not just, we can see that by the fact that he alternates Iberians and Gauls in the center of the line. These are clearly distinct units with some sort of space between them. That means that he and his brother and any other senior officers can see better what's going on, but can also move around. They can ride between units. They can ride along the battle line. They can ride behind them. They can get close to most of those units and talk to them, encourage them, set an example in a way that is much, much more difficult for the Romans in their far more crowded, dense formation.
All of this takes place in the calm before the storm. From here on out, the descent into the maddening true size of Cannae has only just begun. Join us next time as we simulate the crash of armies from both a bird's eye view and the boots on the ground. To support the channel, consider heading over to our Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all our art. We owe a huge debt to our current patrons for funding the channel, and to our researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.